Going to children and God. There are endless numbers of books and articles by professionals, by experts on the subject of child raising and child psychology and so on and so forth. And I don't want to get involved in those areas of child education and so on, but rather try to find some unique element or some unique perspective coming from Hasidus. Not too long ago, the Rebbe mentioned an interesting thing. He says children are by nature impatient, in that they don't appreciate being told to wait. If something is supposed to be, if something is going to happen, if they deserve it, then why wait? Why not now? If it's a good thing, let's do it now. Say, no, we'll do it tomorrow. Why tomorrow? If it's good enough for tomorrow, why can't it be today? And we try to educate and to train a child as he grows up to learn the art of patience, to learn to be able to delay things, to wait for things, and so on. And that's a sign of maturity. But the Rebbe pointed out that before Adam and Eve ate from the tree of knowledge, there was no such thing as waiting. This whole notion of casting your bread on the waters for tomorrow, it may come back to you, that whole idea is a result of eating from the tree of knowledge. Before the eating of the tree of knowledge, there was no such thing. If you put a seed in the ground, you count to 10 and you got a plant. Because the seed makes things grow. So if you put the seed in the ground, something grew. After they had eaten from the tree, God said to Adam, from now on you will eat bread by the sweat of your brow. Which means it will no longer be so easy to put a seed in the ground and then sit down to a meal. Now you're going to have to clear away the thorns and the weeds, and you're going to have to soften up the earth, and you have to plant, and you have to water it, and you have to wait. Then you'll have. After they had eaten from the tree of knowledge, then God said to Chava that she will give birth with pain. Before that, there was no time. There was no waiting. Everything happened immediately. That's the way the world is when the world is perfect. That saying, why put off for tomorrow what you can do today? Before the eating of the tree of knowledge, that's how the world really was. What's tomorrow better than today? Why should something that is already done, you planted the seed in the ground, it's done, there's nothing more you can do. You did everything you had to do, and yet you can't have the results until next summer. What kind of plan is this? That, according to Torah, is part of the punishment for eating from the tree of knowledge. It is not a natural way of being. Children, however, are like Adam and Eve before they ate from the tree of knowledge. In other words, that state of innocence and that state of naturalness that was the condition of the world before the eating of the tree of knowledge is maintained. To some degree, some aspect of it is maintained even after the eating of the tree of knowledge, in that children have the attitudes of the world when the world was young. And that's why a child has no patience. Because the child has not yet been corrupted. Just like the world before it was corrupted didn't wait for anything. If you did something, you had the results. There are other things that children do or children feel or children behave a certain way that we dismiss as being immature and childish. But the truth is that those instincts in a child are usually the true condition, the way things really ought to be. It's the adult who has learned, because of mistakes and because of failures, to adjust to those imperfect conditions and make do with them. And as long as the world is imperfect, and as long as things are not the way they should be, we had better learn to adjust to those conditions. But that doesn't make them right, only necessary. So impatience is really the truth. Patience is a necessary talent, a necessary learned talent. It is not the native, natural truth to the world. A child believes everything he's told by nature until he learns not to trust, until he learns that not everything you hear is true, until he learns that not everything promised is delivered. And when the child learns that and knows that you can't believe everything you hear and you can't believe everything you read, then we applaud that child as having grown up, having matured. And that's probably true, but it's also sad. It's growing up to the corruption of the world. It's not maintaining the innocence of the world. So, looking at a child's behavior, we very often find residue of a world before it was corrupt. In other words, of the truth. Looking into the future, after Mashiach comes, the world will go back to its innocence, which means that the children will again be correct. The world will again be the way a child instinctively knows it ought to be. So in telling a child about God, we're really at a disadvantage, because the child's impulse and the child's instincts are often more godly than what we're trying to teach him. So the first precaution in teaching a child about God is assume that the child already knows more than you're telling him. Not rationally, not logically, not intellectually, but instinctively. A classical incident of driving down the street and the kid suddenly says, a 1-year-old or a 2-year-old kid suddenly says, "Who made that tree?" And you rack your brains to figure out some kind of a smart answer. And not being able to come up with a smart answer and feeling totally frustrated and inadequate, you say, God made it. And the kid says, "Oh." And it's a perfectly good answer. And hey, you threw it out only because you couldn't think of anything smart to say. And yet, the kid is very content with that answer. Because a child's instincts are still very pure and very healthy. And when you tell him that God created the tree, he has no further questions. Tell an adult, God created the tree, you get a dozen questions in return. How do you know? What does it mean, God? What is God? How does he create trees? What? I mean, the answer is not an answer at all. It doesn't satisfy at all. Not because there's any contradiction to it. Not because the adult knows better. What does he know better? He knows who created the tree. He doesn't know any more about that tree than the child. And yet to the child, the answer is an answer, and to the adult, it's no answer. So the adult is left with the question. Doesn't have a better answer. Or if you want to make it more clear, more convincing, with the tree, you can maybe quibble a little bit. But who created the sun? So for the child, you say God created it. The kid knows. Now he knows who created the sun. You tell an adult that God created the sun, he still doesn't know. Not that he knows something else. He just doesn't know. So, but I just told you, and he still doesn't know. That's not because he's smarter. That's because he's more confused. Not as natural, not as innocent. So in explaining to a child that there is a God and that God created the world, there's really very little effort necessary. It's the adult that has the problem, not the child. Teaching God to children, or teaching children about God, is really a very different kind of a project. Once you've told a child that God exists and God created the world, that's all he really cares to know about it. What he needs to know is the consequence or the significance of the fact that God created the world. And that's already an adult thing. To tell a child what is real and what is true is very simple, because a child has a good instinct for what is real and what is true. But to draw conclusions, and to draw proper conclusions, this is already an adult intellectual process. If God did create the world, therefore what? So what? If we don't teach that to the child, then no matter how innocent the child is, and no matter how natural and how pure his instincts are, he can't go anywhere. He has no tracks on which to travel. He knows the facts, but they're not serving him. Incidentally, this is not only true of children. It's true of everybody, because everybody has that child, the part of ourselves that is the child, the part of us that has retained that innocence even into adulthood. So there's a part of us that knows what is the truth. The question is, how do we handle it? What do we make of it? What conclusions do we draw from it that would serve as guidelines to our own life? To say God created the tree is wonderful. So you've answered the question as to where the tree comes from. But then what significance is that to me? So what should I now do with that tree or not do with the tree, knowing that God created it? For this, you have to have an adult. So if we're talking about a child's faith is healthier than the faith of an adult. We talk about a child's mind needs to be filled. So, knowing that there's a God and recognizing God in the world, that comes effortlessly to a child. Knowing what conclusions to draw from that, which is the activity of a mind, not the activity of a soul, here the child needs direction. The child's mind needs to be filled. Depending on what you fill the child's mind with, the child's emotions will develop accordingly. Whatever it is you're going to fill his head with, that's the kind of a person he will grow up to be. Because the heart follows the mind. The mind explains what the soul intuitively knows. So the child's faith, mind, and heart work in sequence. What the soul tells the child, which is the child's faith, needs to be explained by the mind, and what the mind explains will form the heart, the personality, the emotions of the child. In telling a child about God, meaning to say, drawing conclusions for the child, not introducing him to God, but explaining to him what the significance of a creator is. And again, this is true of training ourselves, re-educating ourselves, beginning from our child outward. The important thing here is the details. They once did a study, I forget where this was, here's someplace in the Twin Cities. They showed children films and watched their reaction. They did it for Jewish and non-Jewish, the public school did it or something. Because they wanted to see what children recognize, what things children recognize and respond to the most or something. They were very young children. And they found out that the kids from the temple who were participating in this study remained passive throughout most of the film that had to do with the temple, until it came to the menorah, when they showed the lighting of the candles on Hanukkah. Here suddenly the kids perked up. They knew what it was. They recognized it. It felt familiar. This was their part of the film. Even though beforehand they had shown the temple that they go to, the sanctuary, the ark, nothing. They didn't respond at all. When it came to the menorah, they responded. Anyway, the conclusion of this expensive study that many adults were involved in was simply children react most and relate most to things they've done. It's a great insight. But more specifically, it's not the fact that they did it that makes them respond, because there are many things children do that they're totally bored with, and if you show it to them on film again, they'll only be more bored with it. The reason they responded to the menorah is because they knew the details. Yes, a kid knows where the temple is. He goes there every Sunday. But he doesn't know anything about the temple other than that it is, and that he goes there. And he doesn't like it. He knows what the ark is. He's seen it 1,000,000 times. But he doesn't know any details about the ark. All he knows is that men do something up there. When it came to the Hanukkah menorah, adults in the temple don't like Hanukkah menorahs. Kids do it. Only kids do it. This is something he was told details about. He knows the specifics, and that he can relate to. In other words, children don't respond to generalities, they respond to specifics. Therefore, in telling a kid about morality, about godliness, about being a good kid and a good Jew, the important part is the detail, not the generality. And here, we very often make the mistake. As long as the kid is generally doing it and knows the general idea and is basically behaving, what more do you want? Why do you have to burden the kid with details? So he missed a detail. When we look back, particularly when an older person looks back at their childhood, what they remember is not generalities, but very specific, petty details. One-time events, not some general theme of their childhood. As a matter of fact, when we look at a person who's had a very difficult and unhappy childhood, that is usually characterized by a very vague, general memory of their childhood, without details, because they've blocked them out or whatever the explanation is. But the point is that an unhappy adult is someone who does not have specific memories from childhood. So when we tell a child about God, we need to tell him not that God is a creator and that God created the world and that everything in this world is his. You have to be much more specific. You tell a child that before you put that candy in your mouth, you have to make a bracha. Why? Because it's God's candy. Not it's God's world. That's too vague. It's God's candy. And for this candy, you have to thank God. The same is true also for ourselves. Coming away from Rosh Hashanah, we now have to begin to live with the resolutions and the conclusions that we came to during Rosh Hashanah or during Yom Kippur. Because on Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, the resolutions and the promises that we make ourselves are too universal. They're too cosmic. We resolve on Rosh Hashanah that this year will be better than last year. That's very nice and very important. And that's what Rosh Hashanah is all about. to give yourself an annual plan. But that's too sweeping, it's too general. When it comes after Rosh Hashanah, we then have to take this inspired resolution and break it down to practical, real details. What does it mean you're going to be better? So a person says, well, no, I've got it very specific. I know exactly what I'm going to be a better husband. Or I'm going to be a better wife. That's not quite petty detail. That's still too general. What does that mean? So it means, well, I'm going to be a mensch. That's nice, but what does that mean? So I'm going to be a better human being. The details are not there. It's like telling a child, be a human being, be a mensch. The kid has every intention of being a mensch if you only tell him what that means. I remember being very confused, where in cheder and at home, and in shul, and wherever I went, that term was used so much it became very confusing. One day I'm told, clear up after yourself when you finish eating, be a mensch. All right. A mensch means somebody who cleans up after themselves. An hour later, you find out that if you're careless and you step on somebody else's toy, you're not a mensch. Now, being a mensch, you have to be a mensch. So being a mensch means being careful with toys, with somebody else's toys. And so on throughout the whole day. Whenever you did anything wrong, it was because you're not a mensch. So what is a mensch? A person who never gets criticized. If you never get caught, you're a mensch. And that's the impression it gives. Because no matter what you do, if somebody sees you're not a mensch. There doesn't seem to be any definition to it. And that's very frustrating, not only as a child, as an adult. Because when we make these sweeping resolutions, nothing ever happens, and we disappoint ourselves again. And often we wonder, how come I'm not more of a mensch yet? It was 3 weeks ago I promised myself I'd be a mensch, and nothing's happening. Because the resolution had no details. So in teaching a child about God, we don't start with the generalities. We start with the specifics. You don't first introduce a child to God generally. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. Now, you want to know what that means to you? It means be quiet and listen to your parents. But, well, where's the connection there? And that's why in cheder, traditionally, when a kid is brought to cheder for the first time, and he's going to start learning Torah, they don't start with Bereshis. A child's education does not begin with, in the beginning, God created heaven and earth. Traditionally, a child's study of Chumash begins in Vayikra, where it talks about sacrifices. What animal is brought for what occasion, and where on the altar it's brought, and on what day is it eaten, and who may eat it. A bunch of details. And that's his introduction to God. What does God mean to the child? God means that someone told us to do it this way. That God wants it done like this. That's God. God created heaven and earth. That's fine. So in re-educating ourselves, which is a separate project from learning. I don't know if there's a good word in English. Educating ourselves doesn't mean learning or reading. Educating ourselves means to train ourselves, to raise ourselves, like you train a child or raise a child. There are times when we have to re-raise ourselves, which doesn't come from learning or reading or studying. It comes from training ourselves to think right, to do right, to behave right, to feel right, to respond right, and so on. And just as we stop a child when they're having a temper tantrum, and we say this is not a way to behave, we don't sit down with a book and read to them. You tell them, not like this, the other way. This doesn't go, that goes. This is wrong, that's right. Which is called training, not philosophizing. We have to sometimes do that for ourselves as well. We have to either train ourselves in areas that we never were trained in, or retrain ourselves in things that we should have been trained in a long time ago, but for whatever reason didn't get it. Training means starting with the details. Learning a subject follows a completely different set of rules. In order to study a subject, you have to begin with the generalities. You don't start with specifics. And what happens very often in today's educational theories and experiments is that people treat child rearing in the same way they treat education. But they're really two separate functions, and they're governed by opposite rules. Child rearing begins with details, education begins with generalities. Academic education. Now a word about a child's heart. Based on the information a child is given, the emotions that the child will have, or the reactions a child will have, will be mellowed, if not changed, by the force of the knowledge. A child grows like a plant, depending on where it's getting its light from and where it has room to expand. Wherever you open up the space and give the plant room to grow, that's the direction it will grow in. And whatever direction the light is coming from, that's the direction the plant will go in. The same is true with the emotions of a human being. Emotions are helpless traits, and they grow only where they're permitted and only where they're nourished. So that the heart follows the path that is opened to it. The heart does not choose a path. What opens a path for the heart? The mind. If the mind pursues a certain subject, that subject becomes a possible growth pattern for the emotions. Because now that I know about a certain thing, my emotions can get involved with that thing. If I don't know about it, I can't have emotions concerning it. It doesn't give my emotions an opportunity for growth. Also, information, particularly Torah information, inspired information, holy information, serves like light to a plant. It nourishes the emotions, and the emotions naturally gravitate towards that light. Filling a child's mind with holy things and with instructive things will guarantee that the child's emotions will also be holy and constructive. Which is one of the reasons that Rebbe has mentioned a number of times that a child's room and clothing and books that he reads regularly should not be decorated or filled with images of things that are unholy. Not even unkosher animals. Because the images and the pictures that a child forms and carries around in his mind will also influence his emotions. So when a child is exposed to something immodest, even if the child is not involved in the immodesty, it creates a twist in the emotion that we don't want to see. We don't want the child to have. Every impulse, every potential emotion exists within every heart, and whatever inspires or arouses that particular emotion, that's what the child is going to become. Everybody has a streak of immodesty in them. an immodest side. If something should inspire, instigate, set off the immodest impulses in a child, those impulses will now have a greater growth, greater exercise, greater development than the modest impulses. So that every image, every piece of information, every book we read to a child is not only filling his mind, it's also creating paths, grooves, along which the emotions will develop. So sometimes, in consideration of the emotion that this will inspire, we have to pick certain material and reject other materials, even though academically they both seem to be interesting and important and relevant or whatever. So when we pick books for children, or choose stories to tell children, or even examples by which to explain things, we have to be careful to pick examples that don't instigate and arouse the very opposite emotion of what we're trying to teach. For example, there are these stories, children's stories, that try to teach moral lessons, but in conveying the moral lesson, they sometimes emphasize the negative, how bad it is and how wrong it is to not be good, to such a degree that the example of not being good stands out more strongly and is more convincing and is more entertaining than the example of what it is to be good. And the result is that by presenting that kind of a contrast, you've inspired the kid not to be good, to be bad. And that's why in the Principles of Education, the previous Rebbe's father writes that a teacher who raises his voice in trying to teach goodness and decency to the child has already failed, because his tone of voice is more impressive than what he's saying. And the tone of voice is not right, is not good. So that, for example, if you tell a child, "You're not supposed to do that," you're technically correct. Technically, what you said was correct. You're not supposed to do that. That's true. But what does the child remember? And what does the child hear? The child hears that you're angry at him and that you're threatening him. What will the result be? The result will be that when he sees someone doing something wrong, he'll threaten him. It won't keep him from doing what is wrong. All it did was teach him how to respond to someone else who's doing something wrong. So the tone of voice is as much a lesson as the content of the statement. And although the content is correct, the lesson is totally wrong. Because now the kid knows that it's wrong to do that. But he also knows that when you see somebody doing something wrong, you threaten. And that's not what you wanted to teach him. And then you say to the kid, when you hear him threatening someone else, you say to him, "You're not supposed to do that. Only a father can do that." So fine, so I'll wait till he gets to be a father. Then he'll threaten. So in trying to make a mensch out of ourselves and out of our children, we have to take into consideration these three things: faith, mind, and heart. A child's faith is the least of the problem, because a child's faith is intuitively strong and right on target. And we should be careful that when it comes to inspiring a child's faith, we should at least have as much faith as the child, and not destroy his faith with some confused thinking of our own that really drains all the spirit and all the juice out of the innocent faith that a child has, that needs to be nurtured but not tampered with. So the adult has to tread very carefully when he talks faith to a child. And that's why in the end the children will bring us to Yiddishkeit. When it comes to a child's mind, and this goes also for our own mind when we're trying to educate ourselves, when it comes to the mind of the child, a child's mind thrives on details, not on generalities. And so when you teach a child, you have to teach him details. You have to teach him that this is the way it's done. First you take this step, and then you take that step, and you can't do it the other way. It has to be first this and then that. It may sound a little trite, but the fact is that in teaching a child not to kill, to tell a child it's very wrong to kill anybody, it's not nearly as important or as effective or as significant to the child's growth as to tell the child that you have to put the right shoe on first. Because how often does a child get a chance to kill somebody? He puts his shoes on every day, and some kids 4 times a day. 4 times a day he's going to put his shoes on. Does he know how? So what do you mean how? You put it on. Murder, that's what you should teach a kid, not to be a murderer. But that's irrelevant to a kid. To a kid, you have to teach him the right way of doing what he already does. That will have an effect. That will be significant. You say, yeah, but what a kid does, what does a kid do that's so important? Puts his shoes on, takes them off, puts them on, takes them. That's right. That's what you should teach him. How you put your shoes on. How to tie your shoes. Not just to put them on, how to put them on. When you teach a child to read the Shema, you don't give him the principle of recognizing God being one in heaven above and on earth below. You tell him that when you read the Shema, you have to sit. Say, well, sit, stand, read the Shema. No. It is more important that he knows to sit during the reading of the Shema than to know why he's reading the Shema. And to know that he has to cover his eyes. Not with his left hand, with his right hand. Say, come on, right hand, left hand, what's the difference? He's a good kid, he says his Shema, he never forgets. It's of infinite importance that he knows that he does it with his right hand, not with his left hand. I think I've told the story a number of times already, but it's worth repeating. There was a man in our shul who has since passed away, who was by consensus unanimously voted the nicest guy in shul. There was no question about it. A survivor of the concentration camps and an incredible human being. And one day, during a kiddush in shul, I see him race across the room to cover the bottle of wine that was standing on the table. So I asked him why he did that. And he said, yeah, why? He doesn't know why, but that's how his father always did it. His father was always careful that the wine should be covered, the bottle of wine should be covered when you make kiddush. When I told him that was basically a practice instituted by the Baal Shem Tov, he was in ecstasy. He was so thrilled, he was so excited, he ran to tell his brother that which his father, their father, had done, had practiced, had observed, was a custom from the Baal Shem Tov. Had the order been reversed, had his father told him that there's a custom from the Baal Shem Tov that says to cover the wine before you make Kiddush, and then when he survived the concentration camps and came to America and where there was a Kiddush going on in shul, he saw someone covering the wine. Would he have gotten excited? Would it have had that effect? Would he even remember? Probably not. But his father didn't do it that way. His father didn't sit him down and say, you've heard of the Baal Shem Tov. Well, the Baal Shem Tov says that you should cover. He didn't do it. His father made sure that the wine was covered. What was the result? That 6 concentration camps could not erase that from his mind or from his practice. The wine had to be covered. Having that practice, having that ingrained in him, having that come almost natural, the wine must be covered, and having survived everything, then he hears where it comes from and what the background of it is and what the explanation of it is. Then it's like icing on the top. It's like, it's ecstasy. It's exciting. But had his father told him, this is a custom of the Baal Shem Tov, the excitement wouldn't have been there and the practice wouldn't have been there. It would have been lost.
How about the non-directive parent who says, this is the way I do it, but you can decide for yourself? I've seen that.
It's nishtahi nishtahe. It's an absentee father. He might as well not be there. All he's teaching his kid, and what obviously the result will be that his kid will tell his kid the same thing. This is what I do, you can do what you want. What does that tell anybody? What does that say to anybody? That's not a lesson, it's a non-lesson. You might as well be absent. And that's another thing. There's somebody remarked about a Farbrengen, that when you look at a Farbrengen where people are sitting there of all ages, side by side, listening to the Rebbe speak, I mean, what is this? Isn't there a rating for Farbrengens, and one for children, one for kind of middle-aged people, and one for the elderly, and for the senior citizens, and for the Golden Age Club? And what is everybody in the same room? 12-year-olds and 90-year-olds are still listening to the same speech? I mean, shouldn't this be broken down? What is true obviously has to be true all the time, and every place, and for all people. Because we're dealing with Torah, because we're dealing with divine truth, the age differences disappear. There can't be a truth for a 9-year-old that changes when he gets to be 12 years old, that changes when he gets to be 50 years old. And as a result, in traditional Yiddishkeit, there's a certain equality of the ages, where age doesn't make any difference. What's right is right. And from that perspective, from that point of view, there's no such thing as right for an adult but wrong for a child. Right for a child but wrong for an adult. If it's right, it's right for everybody. If it's wrong, it's wrong for everybody. And so for a father to say, well, this is what I do, but I'm not sure what you should do, then obviously it doesn't matter. Not only doesn't it matter what I do, it doesn't matter whether you did it either. You're obviously not dealing with the truth. Because if it's what you do, but I don't have to do it, so you don't have to do it either. So nobody has to do it. So it's not an important subject, so why are we talking about it altogether? There is, of course, a distinction. There are certain things an adult may do that a child may not. And there are certain things that an adult must do that a child doesn't have. A child should not fast on Yom Kippur. An adult has to fast on Yom Kippur. So Torah makes distinctions. Torah gives us guidelines as to what's right for a 12-year-old and what's wrong for a 12-year-old that was okay when he was only 9, or what's wrong for a 9-year-old that was okay when he was 3. But those distinctions are balanced by an overall equality of the ages. Holiness is good, unholiness is not good. Modesty is right, immodesty is wrong. It's just a question of how much modesty are you capable of. But modesty is right for everybody. And if something is immodest, then it's wrong for everybody. If something is holy, then it's right for everybody. If something is unholy, it's wrong for everybody. So this distinction between adult behavior and child behavior is really not a kosher idea at all. And that, by the way, is one of the secrets of the uninterrupted flow of transmission of Yiddishkeit from generation to generation. It could never work if Yiddishkeit was transmitted from adult to adult. First of all, it would be wrong, because this is not relevant only to adults. Yiddishkeit is for everybody. Secondly, it wouldn't work for very practical reasons. If you don't teach it to the child when he's a child, then it will make no impression on him when he's an adult. It's too late. When you give it to the child while he's innocent, and he absorbs it like only a child can absorb, then you've planted a healthy tree. But if you wait until he's an adult and then give him the information, then all you've done is passed on information. You have not raised a generation of Jews. So the secret to the transmission of Yiddishkeit is that there is no distinction. We try to make as little distinction as possible between adults and children. And that's why it makes sense and it's correct that when the Rebbe is giving out a little bit of his wine after the benching, that people schlep their babies to get a little wine. They're like, it's just a kid. What does age have to do with this? If it's a holy thing, so aren't children holy too? There are certain obligations you can't expect of a child. But we're not talking obligation, we're talking holiness. And it's interesting that when it comes to the laws of holiness that pertain particularly to a Kohen, the laws of holiness that pertain to a Kohen pertain to children as well. You don't have to be a Kohen who is not yet bar mitzvah, also has to be careful and not come into contact with that which is unholy. Age has nothing to do with it. It's only a question of how much responsibility can you place on the kid to take care of himself, not to come into contact with something unholy. So if it's not his responsibility, so it's the father's responsibility. But the kid must not become tamei, must not come into contact with anything unholy, because holiness is not defined by age. And in a more general sense, the holiness of Torah in general is not for adults only. As a matter of fact, with a child who by nature is more pure and more innocent and more holy because he has not yet been corrupt, it is more important that the child be fed a healthy diet of holiness and modesty and goodness to ensure that he will be an adult that is worthy of his title, worthy of the description. So, summing it up again, with the faith of a child, the adult has to be careful not to ruin it, but to nurture it. With the mind of a child, the adult has the responsibility of filling it with those things that are detailed and specific and visible and tangible to the child, because those are the things that make the impression and that form the attitudes of the child. And in doing so, you have to be careful to present those details in such a way that they will also inspire the right emotions and not the wrong emotions. Because the way you teach a child and the things you teach him will open the channels for the heart, and that will determine the personality. So the tone of voice and the examples given and so on, these are things that we have to be careful about, because that's how we affect the heart of a child. There's an example in a story about a guy who was listening to two teachers, and he couldn't decide which teacher he should study under. And finally something happened that helped him make his decision. He was talking to one of the teachers and explaining something that he had learned, and his teacher was very impressed. And he said to him, "The way you explain what you just learned is so good. You explain it so well. I mean, anybody can say it, but you say it so well. I mean, it's like the difference between kishke that has been cooked and is edible, and anybody can eat it and enjoy it, versus a kishke that was spiced properly and given the right amount of attention with the little detail. And that's how much better your description is than the average description of what you just learned." And he was very complimented. But a while later, he was studying with the other teacher, and they were studying some subject. He says, "Wait a minute, let me see if I can give you an example for this. Let me see, what can I compare this to?" And he said, "Well, I can compare it to a child who's been separated, a prince who's been separated from his father, and he yearns to be back with his father, the king, and so on." And something struck him. He said, "Wait a minute. Here are two teachers, each of them looking for an example. And he decided he was going to study under the second teacher. Because something about the choice of examples that the first teacher made left something to be desired. We're talking Torah, and we're explaining a complicated passage in Torah. And what can you compare it to? To a well-prepared kishka. Something's not right. When you're talking about good things and about holy things, your examples have to be holy too. Have to have a morality of their own. Whereas if you say, you know what that's like? That's like food. So what is that telling the kid? So in choosing examples and expressions and tone of voice, you also have to pick those kinds of methods of teaching that relate to the heart, that appeal to the heart. And that's how you cover the three major parts of a human being's ingredients, the soul from which we get our faith, and the mind with which we think, and the heart which determines our personality. Somebody once said that reading Zohar stimulates the soul. Reading Tehillim arouses the heart. The different parts of Torah activate different parts of the person. So in teaching a child, you have to approach all three in order to have a balanced education. You have to appeal to the soul, the mind, and the heart, and all of them correctly. And then you have a very successful time at educating, and the products, the results, are permanent, eternal.
Question: if you could expand a little bit on what you said earlier about consequences.
Well, the consequences of any idea, of any principle, is how does it affect your behavior? Now that you know that, what are you going to do different? How are you going to be different? How has this piece of information changed your behavior? Those are consequences. A statement that has no consequence doesn't really do much. It may be correct, but in addition to being correct, you also have to draw the right conclusions. And that a child can't do. The child can have the right answer because his instincts are good and his intuition is good and so on. But he doesn't know how to take that information and draw consequences from it, apply it to how he ought to behave. He knows, for example, that you're supposed to be good. But what that means, he's not sure. What is good? And how does he know when one thing is right and the other thing is wrong? Well, yeah, I'm not using the word consequence in terms of punishment for misbehavior or reward for behavior, yeah. but rather the logical conclusion from a concept, of the consequence of a concept. So if you know that God created the tree, what difference does that make to your life? So God put the tree there, so? Well, in that particular case, the consequence would be, that's why Torah says that if you're going to war or whatever, you have to be careful not to chop down trees, not to waste the tree, because it's God's creation, not yours. Or other such practical application things. By the way, talking about telling a child not to cross the street, or going to sleep on time. Is it really wrong for the child to cross the street? Is it not safe to cross the street? It's not wrong to cross the street. It's not dangerous to cross the street. Adults do it all the time.
Right.
So it's not that crossing the street is dangerous.
Right, okay.
It's that when you're a child and there's no adult there, it might be dangerous for you to cross the street. For a person to say to a child, it's wrong to cross the street, would be totally misleading.
Yeah.
And the kid wouldn't believe it because he knows that's not true.
Yeah.
As he sees the adults crossing the streets, how can it be wrong? Then if you say to him, it's dangerous to cross the street, you're going to make a nut out of the kid. It's not dangerous to cross the street. So you can't make more of it than it really is. You got to be honest. So what you're telling the kid is that he doesn't know how to cross the street. That's all you're telling him. You're not telling anything about the street. And obviously that has to be treated differently from a statement that is true across the board. For example, you have to dress modestly. Not because you're a kid, and not because it's dangerous, but because because that's true. You're supposed to be modest. That's a very different statement from saying, go to your room, or go to sleep on time. What's on time? It's wrong not to go to sleep at 7. Lots of people don't go to sleep at 7. So you can't make a religion of those things that are not religious. So what's more important, when a kid is not going to sleep at the bedtime you've set up for him, what's more important is that you tell the kid, you're not obeying your mother. Not obeying a mother, that's wrong. That's always wrong. That's not just because you're a dumb kid and you don't know how to go to sleep. So you need somebody to tell you. Obeying your mother, that's a principle that's universal. Now you're saying something significant. But if you say, how come you didn't go to sleep at 7 when you're supposed to go to sleep at 7? What's supposed to go to sleep at 7? I have a feeling that parents who don't teach Yiddishkeit to their children end up making all of these things into a religion. Getting your homework done, being neat, cleaning up your room becomes a religious principle. Families have broken up over it because a kid won't make his room. And then when they hear that a family broke up because the kid wants to be kosher or doesn't want to be kosher and the parents are angry, they say, oh, come on, break up a family over something like that? But they could see breaking up a family because the kid refuses to put his toys away. When you present a rule like stop at a red light, don't treat it like a religious principle, because it isn't. If you're saying go to sleep at a certain time or don't cross the street, tell it as it is. It's a precaution. That's all. A necessary precaution. When the previous Rabbi was being left at home for a weekend because his parents had to go away, and he had hopes that he would be able to go with them on the weekend, and it turned out that he couldn't go because his teacher said he'd be missing too much work. So as his parents were leaving, he was crying. But after a few minutes, he thought to himself, if my teacher says I should stay, and my mother says I should stay, and my father says I should stay, then it obviously is right for me to stay, and good for me to stay. So why am I crying? And he stopped crying. The maturity is just, it's too much. It's not fair. But what that really shows, and what we need to learn from that, a child needs to have a healthy recognition of his own childishness. A child has to have this perception. I'm a child. They are adults. They say I should stay. So what am I crying about? Because I think I should go? But my opinion is irrelevant compared to theirs. Not just wrong. Irrelevant. Non-existent. Blank. Because they all think I should stay. So obviously I should. So why am I crying? Because he thought that he was right. And the injustice. He was crying because of the injustice. And that's usually why a child cries. It's not fair. Not because, but I want it. There's that too. But usually the crying is not because I'm frustrated I don't have what I want. It's because it's so unjust. Here I want it and you won't give it to me. And what I do? Why don't I deserve to have it? Why am I being punished? Because wait a minute, I'm not being punished. It's better for me to stay. So why am I crying? As a matter of fact, he resolved that weekend he would learn better than ever. Which he did. So when you tell a child, don't cross the street. How many times I have to tell you, don't cross the street? You're not really telling them much. Whereas if you tell him, when he doesn't obey, when he doesn't follow the instructions, you didn't listen to your mother. or you didn't listen to your father. Then what you're reinforcing is this awareness that what a father says or what a mother says is right. It's not a difference of opinion. A child's opinion, when it conflicts with an adult's opinion, is insignificant. And a child who can learn that, a child who can accept that, is a very healthy person. Certainly morally healthy. And that's why when an adult is having a hard time with Yiddishkeit, the question of, why should I? It says in Torah that you have to rest on Shabbos. You're not allowed to work on Shabbos. God said don't work on Shabbos. So fine, I believe in the Torah and I believe in God, you've convinced me. God said I shouldn't work on Shabbos. But why should I listen to him? But why should I? That, 99% of the time, that's why people don't observe the mitzvah. And even when they've learned and they're getting into Yiddishkeit, that's what bothers them and stops them. But why should I? What do you mean, why should you? You just said why. Because you read the Torah, you believe in the Torah, and God said you should keep Shabbos. He says, yeah, I know that. But why should I? So let's try it again. God created the world. He rested on the seventh day. He said that you should rest on the seventh day. He says, I know what God said. Why should I do it? What is that question? The question is, I am me. And I have my wants and my opinions. God is God, no question about it. And he has his wants and his opinions. Now the question is, why should I put aside my opinions and my want for what he wants? Because he's bigger than me. What is he going to do, beat me up? And even if he does beat me up, maybe it's worth it. But why should I put my opinion aside for his? What does that mean? Because God said so.
Your parents told you to do something because they wanted you to do it. Because they said so. That's why you had to do it. So God says to do it, so you have to do it. It's equivalent.
It is, but you have to explain it a little bit. Why does a human being obey God? It's a dumb question. It's a dumb question. And a question like that can only come from a child who didn't have the right attitude as a child. Why should a child obey his father? Why? Why should a child take instruction from an adult? Why? There's no answer to that question. It's a non-question. It's like saying, if what you're telling me is true, why should I do it? Why should you do what is true? I know that this is wrong, but why shouldn't I do it? Wait a minute. You know it's wrong, and you're asking why you shouldn't do it? In other words, you want me to explain to you why right is right? There's no explanation for that. You know it's right, but you don't know why you should do it. That's not a question. That's a bad upbringing. When a child knows that a child's opinion doesn't count when it contradicts an adult's opinion, then he has a perspective. Then he has a balance of things. Then he knows that just because you think and just because you want doesn't make it right. Because as a child you wanted silly things, and it was a good thing that your father was there to stop you from it, to tell you otherwise. Not that he debated it with you or argued with you and he came out right. There was no debate, there was no argument. You were a kid and you wanted to play on the highway. Or you were driving down the highway and you wanted to open the door of the car. Say, well, your father figured out that it wasn't such a good idea and he told you not to and you fought about it and you argued, and in the end it turns out your father was right. That's a misunderstanding of the whole thing. It wasn't a question of who was right. Your father had an opinion, you had none. You had no opinion. You were a reckless kid. That's not an opinion. Then why should I do what my father says? Why? Because you have nothing to say. There's only your father's opinion. So what's the question? Should I do what my father says or what? Or what I say? I don't say anything. I'm a dumb kid. I play on highways, if they let me. So if a kid has that perspective, then when you're an adult, and you figure, I want to work on Shabbos, and God says don't work on Shabbos. So what's the question? Whose opinion you should listen to? God says don't work on Shabbos. And I say, but I see with my own eyes that if I don't work on Shabbos, I'm not going to make money. So who are you going to believe? God or what you see with your own eyes? Of course you're going to believe God. Because compared to God, you're still a child. And when you were a child, there was no argument with your father. So now there's no argument with God. So the whole question of, yes, it's true and it's right and God said so, but why should I? That's not a question. That's a spoiled brat. That's a kid who thinks he has an opinion. And where does that come from? Because when he was a kid, nobody told him that he doesn't have an opinion. And this is what the Rebbe, the Frierdiker Rebbe, describes in this letter to this woman. He says, there is cruel kindness and there's kind cruelty. A parent who is liberal, which looks like kindness but turns out to be cruelty, because he didn't give the kid anything to live with or anything to live by, versus the parent who seems to be very strict and unyielding, not irrationally so, but unyielding on the details and very firm and not compromising on what's important, which seems to be cruel, but in the end is really the greatest kindness. Going back to the first statement that we should be studying every day, it seems like it's very important that this particular year, 5745, should be a year of learning. So that once a week really shouldn't be enough. It should be once a day. And even if it's only for 10 minutes. But if it's a regular thing, it's incredible how the 10-minute study sessions add up and the pages add up. And before you know it, you've covered so much ground, you can't believe it. You haven't studied so much since you were in school. Elementary school.